Hello everyone, I'm really glad that you managed to come to this event, the second of the European Book Club, designed by Mark. And let me introduce you today's author, Gaia Vince. Gaia is an award-winning science journalist, author, broadcaster, and speaker, and she's particularly interested in the interaction between human systems and Earth planetary systems, and has traveled the world extensively to research it. She writes books and articles, including for the BBC, The Guardian, New Scientist, Australian Geographic Science, and Gaia makes and presents science documentaries for radio and television, and gives talk around the world, like this evening. Previously, she has held senior editorial positions at the science journal Nature Climate Change, and New Science magazine. And Gaia is also an honorary senior research fellow at the UCL's Anthropocene Institute. On her website, she says, "This is a unique time in Earth history in which climate change, globalization, communications technology, and increasing human population are changing our world and us, and as never before. I am documenting these changes, talking to ordinary people, scientists, and heads of state as we enter into the Anthropocene." And I think that Mark has put the link in the chat about the website of Gaia Vince. And I'll give you the floor to you, Mark, to actually start this wonderful event.
Thank you very much, Martina. I haven't put the link in. I will. It's wanderinggaia.com is the website. And Gaia, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
No, it's a great pleasure. Great pleasure to be with you all.
To talk about your book.
Yes.
When did it actually come out? This is still
September. Yeah, it came out about 3-4 months ago.
Okay. So when will it be paperback? I think that's often people.
Well, next September.
Yeah.
It's always a year. Yeah.
Is it always a year? Is it?
Well, normally, yeah.
Okay. Before it comes into that slightly cheaper format that people rush out and buy. I'm just some quotes in the book, because I know that probably not everybody has had the chance to sort of read it. You say things like, people are finally beginning to face up to the climate emergency. We are facing a climate apartheid. During the limited decades we live on this earth, people should be free to move to locations with better opportunities and not be trapped purely by accident of birth. It is absurd that we are considering the mass migration of billions of people. It's absurd that we're continuing to heat the planet, knowing the consequences. So I just picked out those quotes because they seem really quite powerful throughout your book, those kind of comments. And your book explores the way that much of the world will in fact become uninhabitable, from your perspective, and that we now face unavoidable climate migration. Can you explain a bit more about your thinking on this and really what is happening and what you're talking about in that book with those quotes?
Yeah, so I mean, climate migration is inevitable. It's already underway. We already see climate migration around the world in different places. Parts of the world are already unlivable. At the moment, well, in the year 2000, about 1% of the Earth was classed as uninhabitable. By 2070, it's going to be about 20%. And it will affect around a third of, these are places where around a third of the world's population lives at the moment. So, you know, if you just look at the maths, it's a bit of a problem. Already what's happening as the temperature rises, we're already between 1.2 and 1.3 degrees above the pre-industrial average. We're likely to exceed 1.5 degrees within the next 6 years. We'll actually exceed it probably this year or next year, but that's largely because of the Toba eruption. But what's happening is, as the temperature rises, we're getting all sorts of conditions which make places unlivable, whether it's coastal erosion because of sea level rise and fiercer storms. You know, as we have greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, what they're doing is trapping the sun's energy, and it's that extra energy which is driving these much fiercer storms, these much greater winds, these heat domes which don't just land as a heat wave for a day or two, but actually land for weeks or months. And then we get not the gentle precipitation or the reliable monsoon. We get these devastating flash floods that multiple effects. They wash away infrastructure, houses, and crops, but they also wash away the topsoil, so that the next, you know, it just beats away at resilience, because the community can't recover then properly from one emergency before they're then hit with the next one. And we're getting these back-to-back climate events, extreme events. In the US and in Europe, we've had wildfires breaking out. We're even having wildfires now in February in parts of Europe, which is extraordinary. I mean, but this extraordinary is becoming normal now. We're getting these heat waves that are extraordinary. Every year they're going to become more and more frequent. And, you know, I think something like 3 million people were displaced in the US alone last year. 33 million people were displaced in Pakistan in just a matter of weeks last year. There is already a lot of climate displacement. What's happening is that this is going to increase because the temperature of the planet is going to increase. As I say, we're going to exceed 1.5 within the next 5 or 6 years, and then the temperature is simply going to climb. In terms of what we're going to meet at the end of the century, it could, well, at the moment, it's probably going to be around 3. It could be higher, could be up to 4 degrees. It could be lower. We could hit 2.5 degrees. And you know, that's at the end of the century. So the temperature is going to go up, and then we're going to try and claw back down towards the end of the century to these temperatures. So we're facing some very, very extreme conditions, and these will mostly be felt around the tropics, this equatorial band, which is really great. It's a really, I mean, great in terms of area, not great, just to clarify. And this is also where the greatest populations live, and the greatest populations of the poorest people as well. In the far north, in the northern latitudes, I mean, nowhere will be unaffected by climate change. Everywhere is already affected by climate change, but the impacts will be less further north, and the ability to adapt is much greater there. So that is where people are going to tend to find safety.
Yeah, you talk very much about cities in the new north, don't you? And above that 45th parallel. And for those that haven't seen or read the book yet, you've got some fairly, well, I've showed them to friends and family, some pretty scary maps, really, because there isn't much really above the 45th parallel in terms of land space, or obviously there is land space, but it's quite remote, isn't it? Canada and Greenland.
Yeah, I mean, it will be, you know, this is a century of change, of massive upheaval. Everything will change. It has to change. We're already seeing our energy systems change very slowly, but that is a huge transition. We're undergoing a huge revolution at the moment. It's very hard to see because we're right in the middle of it. So we don't have the perspective to go outside of it and, you know, look back from a century on to what's happening. But it is extraordinary. If you think that fire making, that very human skill, is fundamental to our species, it's what makes us human. You know, our species emerged in Africa something like 200 to 300,000 years ago. And was characterized by its great mastery of fire, of that external energy source. And really that's how we've created these incredibly complex, sophisticated societies, it's all through burning stuff. So now to move away from burning stuff, that very human technology, to a different source of energy, and it could be, you know, it could be a much more democratic source of energy. It could be locally produced, locally harnessed, community owned, rather than owned by a few commercial enterprises in a few rich nations that have basically colonized spaces around the planet that can produce fossil fuels. So we could be making a much more just transition there. I hope so. But everything will change in terms of where we live, how we live, what we eat, how we make that food, and where we make that food. You know, at the moment, we're also living through a biodiversity crisis. Ecosystem restoration is going to have to be part of this century. We're going to have to change everything. And what I'm saying in this book is that as part of that change, part of this transition, we have to factor in that human movement is going to happen on this scale. We have to plan ahead. We have to when we have a vision for our future, we have to think about these cities that people are going to live in and how they're going to be built sustainably, productively, so people have hope and opportunity in the future and they feel part of a truly inclusive society, rather than, you know, the alternative, which is conflict, which is misery, which is people pitted against each other purely because of where and who they are born.
Yeah, I mean, another quote in your book is, some are migrating. Obviously, people have migrated throughout history. We're just touching on that in terms of from the Rift Valley over those tens of thousands of years. But some are migrating to save their lives. And that's kind of where we are. Do you think, Guy, that people feel that in the European context as well? I was just talking before we started, there's been very little rain in the Po Valley, and what that's done to the River Po and Venice, the river's drying out. A lot of southern Spain for much of the year is, you know, almost Saharan.
Yeah, really. I mean, you know, southern Spain, southern Europe is definitely going to be hit. It's already being hit. So, I mean, southern Spain used to have a Mediterranean climate. It's very much moved to desert. The reason that it's managed such incredible agricultural production is because it's happening in an artificial environment. You know, it's the kind of plastic bag landscape of Almeria, which is interesting. Actually, it's also working as a form of geoengineering, because all of this plastic, you know, these greenhouses, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but in large parts of what is essentially unfarmable desert now, they have these hydroponic greenhouse systems of controlled, you know, humidity and everything, and that's where our tomatoes come from across Europe. A lot of fruits and vegetables. At the moment, they can sustain it a lot with desalinated water, because there's no water there now. And the effect of this greenhouse is actually to reflect back so much of the sun's rays that it's actually created a cooler regional climate. It's quite interesting. So, you know, adaptations like that will enable certain places to persist a lot longer. I mean, there are places that are already effectively unlivable. I mean, if you look at places like Qatar, Dubai, you know, they do have populations, but the people who are living there it's a small population that's very wealthy, that lives in an artificially cooled environment where everything is brought to them. Food is imported, water is imported, absolutely all their resources are brought in. And, you know, that's, if you call that living, they're basically living in a shopping mall. And, you know, that's possible for a small population of very wealthy people. But I mean, you know, the moment you go outside of that, if you look at construction workers, you know, other laborers, they're dying, right? They have a huge death rate because it's unlivable. Those conditions are unlivable like that. You know, heat stroke, kidney failure, all sorts. I mean, you know, it's not just the climate, it's poverty, it's, you know, so you know, there will be people still living in small populations in these unlivable zones, but they will have to be a lot smaller. The populations, they will have to live in much more carefully controlled, adapted artificial environments. I mean, if you take somewhere like Mumbai, that's a population of 22 million people. 9 million of those people are living in slum housing, which is just like concrete boxes with, you know, metal roofs, and the temperature in these places, which has already got terrible sanitation, there's very still air. It's really you know, and they're right on the ocean as well, so there's sea level rise and storms, they're constantly inundated. The temperature in these little boxes in these houses are already 8 to 10 degrees above the temperature in the Mumbai city proper. And, you know, there are air conditioned units in some of those hotels and apartments and office blocks. But, you know, when there is a heat wave and they're switched on, there's immediate power outages and they run off diesel generators. I mean, this is a real problem. So, you know, you can't adapt that by just putting aircon units into every one of these little boxes. This is not a solution. And the population, there's 9 million people living in slums, is growing because people are still migrating because of climate change from rural areas, because there's the drought, there's no river flow anymore. They've been pumping water from the aquifer is now dry, there's no livelihood, the crops have failed, been washed away due to coastal erosion, whatever. People are, you know, these are growing. That's a problem. It's a real problem, and it's happening everywhere from Mumbai to Nairobi to, you know, to Lagos to Lima. You know, this is a huge problem that we're not talking about. People will not be able to adapt to the conditions that they face in the coming decades. This is at 1.2 degrees. You know, when we hit 2 degrees, when we hit 1.5 degrees, you know, this is going to be a huge problem.
Yes, yeah. I mean, your book looks at these extreme heat hotspots. I think you call them extreme heat hotspots. Yeah, and you've been talking about South Asia and obviously Southern Europe, which we've touched on. But there's obviously Australia.
Mm-hmm. Australia is the Amazon. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, these are, you know, Australia is an extraordinary country. It's the population is growing there.
With your maps, you know, there's that in the north above the 45th parallel. Where do you suspect people will want to migrate from, say, South America or Australia?
Well, they're already migrating from many of these places. So they will generally they will need to migrate to, at the moment, the most the fastest growing cities, the most economically you know, where they're facing the most economic growth are many of them are in this band. The economic kind of hotspot is going to have to move north. I mean, it will move further north. There will have to be a new northern economy. People are moving. I mean, we're all facing it in different ways. So one thing that we see quite a lot in Northern Europe, right, is the loss of the whole ski industry. It's completely changing. Most skiing, you know, this is artificial snow is keeping alive a lot of the ski industry, right? And you might think, well, that's, you know, my smallest violin is not small enough for that, right? But this is a problem. This is a cultural loss for many communities in Northern Europe. It's you know, it's a big change. The landscape is shifting. Skiing is now moving to places like Lapland. These are the places, you know, where there are mountains, because a lot of Lapland is not mountainous. So this sort of transition is happening. People are moving further north instead of having, you know, a holiday house in southern Spain or in southern France. People will choose to have their holiday house somewhere on the lakes of Sweden or something like that, you know. So that sort of transition is happening economically now, in terms of when people buy new property, whether it's a new house or farmland or office space or whatever. they have to factor in the insurance costs, and those insurers are not going to insure places that are a massive fire risk, that a huge flood risk, are going to be swept away in storms, have water access problems. So that shift is happening in rich countries already. People are already facing problems trying to sell places that are basically in flood zones. They're getting locked in. And so, we need a strategy for dealing with this. We need a strategy for dealing with climate displacement in rich nations, as well as the enlarged populations that will be coming from other countries as well.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. I mean, you say again in your book, migration will save us, because it is migration that has made us who we are. And migration is the oldest survival trick. So in the terms of the solutions, because I think your book really moves on to that, because some of the horrors of the climate situation, as you just been outlining in your book, that need to be obviously tackled or redressed, or solutions there. With demographic aging, I think you call it grey societies, or increasing grey society, and the depopulation crisis in some of the northern hemisphere, your book focuses on migration being a solution, bringing benefits to host or destination countries, not how it's being presented clearly at the moment through much of Europe. Why do you say this? How do you think it will be the solution? And how actually we can change the narrative, particularly in Europe, around migration, where, at the moment in the UK, there's a trickle of migrants, and it's one of, the Prime Minister's 5 key priorities, we
are facing a demographic crisis at the moment. We're simply not having enough babies to support an aging population. I mean, it's already a huge problem in terms of labor. Like, we don't have enough GPs, we don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough truck drivers, farm laborers, hospitality workers, dentists. I mean, really, we don't have enough workers, and that is the result of political decisions, policies, Brexit. The solution to that is immigration, as the government well knows. So with one face, it's sort of, going to act on migrants, we're going to cut down, we're going to have less people, we're going to send them to Rwanda, whatever. With the other hand, it's like bringing them in, because it's a huge problem. We just, businesses cannot survive with the job, and it's not just here. It's happening across Europe. There is a huge shortage across many nations now, with just in terms of the workforce. The solution to that is immigration, as everyone knows, even the most xenophobic government, but it needs to be handled properly, and it needs to be done. First of all, we need to have honest conversations about this, with a strategy, with a plan in place, with a vision. How do we see our societies in 20 years, 30 years, and how do we take steps to work towards that? We are going to need more people. We're going to need more immigration. How do we handle that? And it needs to come with investment, and that's financial investment to make sure that there is enough housing, infrastructure, healthcare provision, schools, all of these things, which at the moment is inadequate for the existing population, let alone the expanding population. And that is a policy choice again. But, if that's not provided, that leads to conflict. It leads to the impression that the reason that these things are not happening, are not available, is the fault of the migrants. The other thing is social investment. There needs to be huge amounts of, a cohesive and progressive narrative around migration, around inclusion, around the idea that people coming into our communities are part of a new expanded society. They are, in Britain, they are new Brits. In France, they are new French, right? They are building the new Parisians, the new Genoans, right? They are part of building a new society in which all our needs are aligned, right? We all want to live in a healthy, sustainable, productive, economically productive society, a city with opportunities for ourselves, for our children. That's what we all want. And, you know, deliberately stoking divisions between parts of society is not just unhelpful, it's you know, it's not going to work properly, as we've seen. So, you know, we need to get real about this. We need to face that, you know, migration is inevitable, and it's this tiny trickle is really just that. It's going to get a lot bigger, and we need to discuss that. We need to talk about it at policy level, and, you know, counter some of these false narratives, these myths that that are being propelled, you know, centre around that you know, that immigration lowers wages. It doesn't. That immigration increases unemployment. It doesn't. In fact, the opposite is true, because, you know, an economy is not a zero-sum game. You know, there aren't a certain number of jobs available, and if immigrants come in, they take those jobs, so they're not available for the existing population. That's just not true. The economy expands; it becomes more productive, but it needs investment, and that financial and social investment, that true inclusivity that can make it work. You know, allowing people to help themselves, to move around, to find employment straight away, you know, not have to, you know, wait on an absolute, survive on a tiny pittance of benefits. That's not in sort of dehumanizing conditions. That's not helpful to anyone. It doesn't help the existing society, it doesn't help the immigrants, doesn't help anybody. It's just very damaging.
I mean, sure. I mean, I think, you know, across Europe in many countries, and a colleague here from Finland, I was in Sweden last week, anti-racism conference. I mean, clearly, you know, this narrative, this false narrative has been weaponized by the far right, and it's being very effectively used, actually.
And I wouldn't just say that, right? Because of course the far right is going to use this and weaponize it. You know, that's who the far right are. The problem is it's not been challenged. There's been an absolute abdication of responsibility by centrist, left, even moderate right-wing people. It's been, that narrative needs to be challenged. There needs to be an alternative narrative, which is much more inclusive, multicultural, an admission that people, you know, there isn't like some sort of you know, pure Brit or pure Finn or pure German or whatever. That's a fantasy. It's not biologically true. It's not culturally true. It's just bullshit, to be honest. So, you know, this idea that people, they have multiple identities, and that enriches society, and it doesn't, there isn't a loser. You know, when someone comes with a new culture, your culture doesn't disappear. If somebody comes with a new skin tone, it doesn't mean that they are less, you know, of that city. We need to change the way we see nationality, because it's not fit for an upheaval that we're facing this century. It's not fit for the Anthropocene, for a world of, you know, dynamic climate, dynamic earth system change, human movement. It's a nonsense anyway. You know, people are mixed up. They are going to move. We need to make it work, because the alternative is horrific.
Yeah, I mean, in your book, I mean, the numbers can give a sense of overwhelm when I was reading the book, you know, because the numbers are very large, and you know, I think you look at the UN predictions on this, but you talk about a billion people needing to move by, is it 2050?
Yeah, so you know, this is very hard to predict, because it depends on so many different things. It depends on how much money is given to adaptation. It depends on, you know, how much we mitigate. It depends on all sorts of things. But at the moment, the numbers vary from hundreds of millions of people to 1.5 billion people by 2050. It's like, you know, it could go either way. It depends how fast you know, things change. We already see large numbers of people moving who are not counted as climate refugees, because climate change is a threat multiplier. You know, it's part of many other problems, whether it's poverty or marginalization or conflict or environmental excuse me, environmental degradation. All sorts of things lead a person to decide they can't stay there anymore. And climate change is a big pusher that kind of adds to all of these other pressures. You know, I've come across many people who have had to leave kind of their ancestral village where their families have lived for generations. They own land, they had rural livelihoods, whether it was agriculture or related jobs. And, you know, consecutive years of drought, maybe followed by floods, followed by, they just can't live there anymore. They can't make a living. So they have moved to the slum of the nearest city and got a job in a factory or hawking stuff. You know, they're classed as economic migrants because they've moved for work somewhere else. But really, they are also climate migrants, right? Because the only reason they left their homes, their village, their family, the land, their only wealth, is because the climate made it untenable. And that sort of movement has been, you know, it's going on much, much faster at the moment, and it is exacerbated by other things.
Yeah, thank you, Gaia. And at the end of the book, you've got your 8-point manifesto. Well, you know, it's like, yeah, and I just, you know, in terms of my questioning, I mean, how, you know, you've just touched on this earlier about changing the narrative and trying to change it very quickly so that you can then get cooperation with governments across the European Union, across the Northern Hemisphere. So your manifesto, what are you aiming to do with that next? How you what would you like to see emerge from your book, which is a call to arms, isn't it? You know, it really is a call to arms.
It is. I mean, it was born out of frustration because, you know, I've been talking and writing and working in climate change for decades now. God, I'm old. And you know, initially it was about convincing people that climate change was not something that would maybe happen in the future, but was already happening, like, to people now, because I'd seen it. And then it was about convincing people, you know, that not just do we have to mitigate, but we actually have to adapt to this different world that's coming. And now I really want to push the narrative on and say, you know, there are places where people cannot adapt. We need to talk about that. I wanted to start a conversation, and, you know, instead of just sort of whirling from one disaster to another and oh, what should we do? Who should we send aid to? We're a bit torn now because there's so much disaster happening everywhere. You know, what have we got at the moment? New Zealand, terrible. Turkey and Syria. Well, that's unusually, that is an earthquake, although actually climate change will also in some places make earthquakes more frequent, which is rather alarming. But also, you know, we have disasters are just going to continue to happen. What we need to do is to have, in my opinion, a long-term vision of what we want to see. And that needs to be laid out by leaders. You know, they need to engage with this, and the public needs to engage, and we need to look at what choices we have, because we do still have many, many choices. You know, the future is unwritten. We have many choices. We can decide which path to go down, but I would much rather we did that in a democratic way, you know, in countries where that is possible. And we're lucky enough to live in countries where there is democracy, where there can be discussions about these things. Choose the future that is possible and that we want to do, and the path we want to go down, and then, you know, set out steps to do that. Well, at the moment we're having, you know, crazily mixed messages on climate change, where, you know, one minute we're leading we're hosting the COP. You know, we're leading in deciding we're going to meet net zero, our net zero commitments. We're doing all this at the same time we're opening coal-fired power stations, you know, and fracking and all that. I mean, you know, we don't have any sort of coherency or consistent plan at all, which just undermines the whole message. And in terms of migration, we're not even beginning to have any kind of narrative about, what human movement means and how we can make it work. It's still this very sort of primitive response to sort of batting people back, which is, I mean, that's just not, that is not a response. That's not a plan. It's not a strategy. And it certainly won't work when, larger numbers of people arrive. It's just not going to work. So, what then is the plan? Are we going to arm people to fight, refugees in the streets? Is that what we're going to do? Because, that's the sort of alternative we're looking at. We can't continue down this route. We have to come to some sort of arrangement. And I would think that this needs to be an international global negotiation, because this is a global crisis that's affecting multiple countries. But it also needs to start at community level. How are we going to make it work at community level and, city level and regional level, and agreements between different groups? We need some sort of vision, strategy, plan, and yeah, it's very much a pragmatic book.
Yeah, and we've certainly got a bit of a deficit of leaders, haven't we, to kind of lead that, which is a huge shame. I mean, is there a particular political movement that's getting behind this argument and the plan that you're outlining? I'm just wondering that as you were just talking. Is anybody getting behind that? Or is everybody trying to sort of avoid it or weaponize it?
Well, it seems like people are avoiding it. Most of the political parties are actually avoiding. They're not talking about it. Some are doing better than others. I mean, I have to say that Nicola Sturgeon's SNP, when had a much more kind of progressive outlook on immigration than the UK governments. Canada is planning on trebling its population. That's its national project. It wants to increase its population. It's bringing lots of migrants in, and it's got lots of programs to help make that work. I mean, this is something that is, this scale of human movement is something that countries really need to start talking about. I don't see progressive. There's just sort of a timidity to discuss it, to approach it, and think about it at the moment. I've been actually quite impressed with Antonio Guterres, who has really fundamentally understood that climate change is an integral part of all the other crises that are affecting the world. It is integral to how poverty is resolved, how health is resolved, and conflict. But yeah, no, there's been really poor leadership on this.
Thank you, Gaia. Thank you very, very much indeed. Look, let's open this out to others in the room. Who would like to make a comment, ask a question? Is anybody got a question or a comment they'd like to make? I see Nigel, you've made a comment in the chat. Do you want to explain that point a little bit more? Nigel?
I'm not conscious of making any comment at all.
Oh no, sorry. Sorry, Nigel. There's another comment in here from somebody else who's maybe, I don't know. I thought it was you. It's about the ice age or something like that. I didn't quite know what was coming there. Okay. Enrique, have you got any comments? Or yes, Enrique.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gaia, for an invigorating talk, and actually you made my night, with all these things that you said about immigration and how we have to sort of like step up, the plate and accept that. But my question is this: I mean, why is it in Europe and elsewhere politicians are so meek about talking about this thing, about inclusion? That immigration, I mean, we can look at history and we can say, well, since Ramapithecus, right, when he came down from the became terrestrial from arboreal, people started to migrate, and people have always migrated. And why is it difficult for these politicians to sort of like show leadership and say, well, look, let's treat these people nicely, let's make this thing work, and
I mean, I think we're
values.
Yeah, I think we're living in a particularly difficult time. So migration was very much thought before recently. Migration was very much something which countries sort of competed to get more people into their country because they needed them to fight wars, to do agricultural work. There was quite a I mean, even as recently as the £10 POMs, people were offered money to move to Australia. But recently what's happened is there has been this really, first of all, it's the easiest trope in the world for a leader that's, especially a populist leader, who is not doing very well in the polls, to find a group to demonize and to blame everything on, and historically that has been foreigners, migrants, poor people, Black people, so they're an easy group. And once you start doing that a lot, it's quite hard to row back on that, because then what's the alternative? Oh, is it that you're a really bad leader or that your policies haven't worked? So we've got into a bit of a pattern with that. That's one thing. I mean, there's also been certainly, there's been this kind of era of populist leaders in the last sort of decade, which has been really troubling, because that's obviously the kind of the idea of nationality and nationhood is intrinsic to a lot of the populist leaders, especially if they're quite far right. We've had the Brexit, the very polarizing Brexit debate, which has largely played on immigration and migrants taking your jobs, taking your meaning that your wages have gone down, all sorts of other things. And so I think what's happened now is, first of all, we don't have very high caliber of leaders at all. Certainly in Britain, the entire government is extremely, in my opinion, anyway. So we don't have very good, thoughtful leaders. I was really thinking, actually, Joe Biden has been quite progressive on that, and I was just thinking, because Jimmy Carter, the news about him going into hospice, I was just thinking of that sort of caliber of leader. We don't have very high caliber leaders at the moment in a lot of Europe, certainly in Britain. And there is a timidity about even raising the issue in Britain because of that very hostile, toxic Brexit debate, which is still very much in people's minds. I mean, people, even raising the idea of Brexit and discussing that is almost a taboo at the moment. So that's a real problem here. But actually, if you do surveys, right, in London, you find that people are not nearly as xenophobic or racist as the leadership is, that the government is. So there is a mismatch, actually. The general population are much less prejudiced.
Yeah, I was just trying to explain earlier to some colleagues, Gaia, that the UK government actually now wants to come out of the European Convention on Human Rights. And that's all around migrants and refugees. And I've got a few quizzical faces from colleagues about what's going on there. Why would they want to even do that? So everything's
the UK government, that's one of the things that Britain should be proud of, was a fundamental role, had played a fundamental role in setting that up in the first place. So see how far we have fallen.
It's a big fall. It's a very big fall. Do you think the just coming on some of these issues, I mean, you've got Poland and Hungary certainly not wishing to particularly cooperate within the European Union to deal with asylum seekers and refugees now. Do you think there's a religious element to, or an intersection around religion and migration at this point, Gaia?
I do, yeah. So I think it's quite, I mean, they're very different countries, actually. So Poland has quite, is quite a religious country generally. Hungary is actually not, but Orban has used religion in a very motivated, manipulative way to seed this kind of far right agenda. I think there actually is an overlap there. And I think it's quite interesting, actually, the role religion is playing in this in various places. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So the Ukrainian crisis, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, these are a sort of a Christian white people that are fleeing, and they have been much more accepted in European societies, Christian societies, than refugees from Afghanistan, for example, that had their crisis overlapping around the same time, and Syria. And I think that's quite interesting, how that's played out. But I would also say that since writing this book, there's been a noticeable interest and engagement from mainly Christian communities. I would say that I'm not religious, actually, but from Christian communities, from the Church of England, from American churches and so on, to engage with this and to talk about it in a way that makes me realize a lot that this subject, this moral leadership, is still there. I mean, in religious spaces, but there has been a vacuum in the civic space, and this is a very big problem. These are the sorts of issues that should be being discussed by elected politicians in a civic space. These are the sorts of issues that should be resolved there. Of course, religious groups will take these issues on because that's bread and butter for them. But this is the sort of issue which should also be discussed in a compassionate way, solution focused, with different viewpoints in the civic space, in the civil society. And it is not being done in Britain, and it's not being done in a number of other. And that's a huge problem, actually. It's a huge vacuum there. I mean, of course, there are NGOs and there are various groups that are kind of engaging with these issues, but it should be, there is this kind of moral vacuum at the core of our legislative institutions, I would say, in the last 5 or more years. It's really worrying. It's something that I think leaders like Gordon Brown, for example, really engaged in. I'm talking about British politicians now that you probably don't even remember, but he was somebody who did engage in these issues. And I would say Nicola Sturgeon also engaged in a lot of these issues. You don't have to agree with everybody's opinions on this, but they need to be debated in civic society, right at the heart of governance. That's where they belong, and there has been there's been a vacuum there.
Well, I certainly hear you on that, very, very much so. I mean, yeah, maybe some of the religious leaders is fighting a bit of a rearguard action, obviously over Rwanda, and there was some strong statements.
Yeah, there have been. Yeah, there have been, and you would expect that. But we should also, the point of a politician is to do that job as well. That's what I'm saying. You would expect religious leaders who, that's kind of what they're supposed to be thinking about, right?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, I must say. Is there any other comments or questions from anybody in the room wants to say something? We've got just a few minutes more. Look, thank you very much, Gaia, for your time. I think you've given us all a great deal of food for thought. We've got. Also, I've got somebody's clapping, you know, so really thank you very, very much for your time.
No, it's my pleasure. It's a great pleasure.
Share your words
Mm.
and the things you've been saying, and this recording with lots of other people across that civil society space. I would just add that, you know, civil society is unfortunately a lot weaker than it used to be because of resources and the threats that it faces, you know, because of lack of government support, really, in many ways.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, you know, these are the sorts of issues that should be right at the heart of government, you know, as well. This is what MPs should be talking about, in my opinion.
I know. Well, I think a lot of us in this room will concur with your opinion on that. We really, really will. And we're trying to do that in our small way across Europe, and with colleagues. We work with the European Network Against Racism. We're working with other religious groups. I was just thinking about Muslim organisations, and that obviously feel very under siege, but you know, would want to be saying more about these issues. But rather than just reacting to the kind of the anti-Muslim racism and hate that comes on in many cases. I think there are people of faith and people within civil society that really do want to do a lot more. They probably do need a few more of the Gordon Browns spread across European countries, you know, that can give them that feeling of confidence at the moment, which is seems to be sadly lacking, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So thank you.
Vision for a better world, really. Well, that's what we need. We need a vision that can be conveyed of, you know, because it's you know, the future doesn't have to be bleak, you know, we can make it better.
Well, there's other research about that, isn't it? About that deficit in public imagination, social imagination, where people think that anything will improve at the moment. So I think it's quite a difficult one to motivate people on some areas, and particularly on this, you know. It's not just a rearguard action, but I think that, you know, your book certainly has the solutions in it. You know,
well, I hope so. Yeah,
it tackles the demographic, you know, time bomb was in Europe. You know, so we absolutely want to share it with as many people as we can.